The silence, after so many years of shouting, was the first thing he noticed. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy, watchful quiet of a land holding its breath. The last rebels in the mountains had bent the knee. The final conspirators in the palace had been silenced. For the first time in his memory, from the Guadalquivir to the mountains of the north, the land obeyed a single voice. His voice. He stood on the highest terrace of the Madinat al-Zahra, the marble still cool beneath his bare feet in the dawn light. Below him, the new city was a symphony of ordered chaos. The distant clink of chisels on stone, the murmur of 1,000 workers, the scent of cedarwood and wet plaster carried on a breeze from the Sierra. He had willed this city out of the earth, a declaration not just of power, but of permanence. A kingdom of stone, to replace the kingdom of dust and blood he had inherited. But stone was not enough. A title was not enough. Emir was a word for a ruler of a faction, a tafer before its time. It was the title of his grandfathers, who ruled a fractured, bleeding land. He could feel the old title like an ill-fitting robe, woven from the same threads of discord he had spent 2 decades cutting. The idea had been growing in him, a quiet, relentless vine, as he toured the libraries of Cordoba. He'd run his fingers over the spines of ancient volumes, works from Baghdad, from Damascus. He'd listened to the scholars he'd gathered from across the world, a Persian astronomer charting the stars from his new observatory, a Greek physician translating texts of medicine. They spoke of a world beyond the Pyrenees and the sea, a world of empires. And in that world, there was one title that cast the longest shadow: Caliph. It was more than a word. It was a claim. A claim to the legacy of the central leadership himself, a direct lineage of leadership of all the faithful. In the east, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was a hollow figurehead, a prisoner of his own mercenaries. The Fatimid Caliph in North Africa was a rival, a sheer challenge to the very order of the world. The West. The West had no voice. That morning, in the cool privacy of his study before the court assembled, he unrolled a scroll. The decree. His secretary, the eloquent Muntir ibn Said, had drafted the words, but the fire in them was his own. It spoke of the weakness in the East, of the righteous duty to defend the faith, of the unity he had forged with his own hands. In these times, when the title of Caliph has been neglected, when darkness has fallen upon its meaning, and when the one who bears it in the East cannot even defend the roads of his own capital, God has seen fit to grant the dignity of this office to the most worthy. His hand did not tremble as he signed it. Abd Al-rahman, commander of the faithful. The heat of the day was building as he walked into the great hall of Madinat al-Zahra. The air shimmered with the scent of rosewater and amber. Before him, the entire court was arrayed, Berber chieftains in white robes, their faces etched with desert winds, Visigothic converts in fine silks, judges, poets, generals. The very mosaic of peoples he had subdued and united. The silence returned, deeper now, pierced only by the rustle of silk and the faint, metallic whisper of 100 sword hilts brushing against belts. He did not sit. He stood before them, and Muntir ibn Sa'id stepped forward, the scroll held in steady hands. The secretary's voice, usually so measured, filled the vaulted space, each word a hammer stroke on the anvil of history. Hear the decree of your lord. The Caliph, al-Nasir Lidin Alahi, who fights victoriously for the religion of God. A wave of sound, not quite a gasp, more like a collective exhalation, swept through the hall. He watched their faces. In some, he saw instant calculation, the understanding of a political earthquake. In the eyes of the old Arab families, he saw a flicker of awe and, perhaps, relief. This was no longer just the strongman grandson of a refugee. This was a sovereign in the line of the ancients. The Berber chief stood taller. This title was a crown for the kingdom they had helped build. Then came the sounds of affirmation. Not shouts, but a deep, resonant murmur of acceptance. The sound of power changing its shape. The rustle as the first courtier prostrated himself in a new, deeper obeisance. Then another. And another. A sea of bowed backs and foreheads pressed to the cool marble floor towards him. He remained standing, looking out over them. The heat from the braziers mixed with the warmth of triumph in his blood. The title was now a fact. Al-Andalus was no longer an emirate on the edge of the world. It was a caliphate, the equal of Baghdad. The challenge to Kairouan. He was the axis around which the West would now turn. That night, on the terrace again, he listened. The sounds of the city below were the same chisels, murmurs, the breeze. But they meant something different now. They were the sounds of a new dawn, not just for a palace, but for an empire he had just named into existence. The long, bloody night of his youth was finally, irrevocably over. The age of the Caliph had begun. The sun beat down on the parched earth, a relentless hammer against the shields of the Umayyad cavalry. Dust, thick and choking, rose in plumes with every thundering hoofbeat, coating men and horses in a fine, gritty film. This was the reality of Al-Andalus in the early 10th century, a land fractured, bleeding, its once proud emirate reduced to a patchwork of rebellious fiefdoms. From the rugged mountains of Malaga to the fertile plains of Evora, warlords and tribal chiefs defied Cordoba's authority, their banners mocking the very idea of a unified realm. Abd al-Rahman, barely into his third decade, rode at the head of his army, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering haze that promised another confrontation. He had inherited a throne besieged not by external foes, but by its own people. The shadow of his grandfather, the revered Abd al-Rahman I, felt impossibly vast. Yet where others saw chaos, he saw a canvas. Where they saw endless rebellion, he saw a kingdom waiting to be reborn. His campaign to reclaim the South, to bring the defiant strongholds back under the fold of Cordoba, was not merely a series of battles. It was a declaration. Each parley, each siege, each swift, decisive strike was a stitch in the unraveling fabric of his dominion. The clang of steel on steel, the guttural cries of men, the desperate shouts of surrender, these were the sounds of his will being forged into reality. He remembered the whisper of advisers, their voices tinged with weariness. The Hashemites of Seville are too entrenched, my lord. The Banu Hajjaj of Carmona, impregnable. But Abd al-Rahman had simply tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes burning with an unshakable resolve. He would not yield. He would not allow the legacy of his ancestors to crumble into dust. He had learned from the bitter lessons of his youth, the constant threat to his own life, the ruthless calculus of survival. This was not just about power, it was about destiny. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The siege of Isija had been a brutal affair, its walls crumbling under the relentless assault of catapults and battering rams. He had walked among his exhausted troops, a silent, imposing figure, sharing their hardships, fueling their courage with his mere presence. The heat of the Andalusian summer was a constant adversary, dehydrating men, cracking lips, but Abd al-Rahman pushed on, driven by a vision that transcended the immediate discomfort. He knew that the very heart of his fractured realm, the symbol of its defiance, lay in the impenetrable mountain fortress of Bobastro, the stronghold of the legendary rebel, Umar ibn Hafsun, now commanded by his sons. It was a festering wound, a defiant beacon for all who challenged Umayyad rule, and it had to fall. The march towards Bobastro was a testament to his strategic genius and his unwavering resolve. He didn't rush. He encircled, he starved, he patiently chipped away at the rebels' network of support. He offered clemency to those who surrendered, a shrewd move that peeled away layers of resistance, turning former enemies into allies, or at least neutral observers. He understood that loyalty, once earned, was a far more potent weapon than fear. As he stood on a high ridge, gazing at the formidable silhouette of Bobastro in the distance, a flicker of an internal monologue passed through him. This is not just stone and mortar, he thought. This is an idea. An idea of defiance that must be extinguished, not with blood alone, but with a new promise. A promise of order, of justice, of a future far grander than this endless cycle of rebellion. He envisioned Cordoba not as a city under siege, but as a beacon, a center of learning, a haven of prosperity. That vision, vivid and potent, was his guiding star through the dust and the din of battle. Back in Cordoba, even as the campaigns raged, the first faint stirrings of this new era began to emerge. His trusted viziers, empowered by his explicit instructions, initiated meticulous reforms. The chaotic tax system, once a patchwork of local levies and arbitrary demands, began to be centralized, rationalized. Roads, long neglected, saw the first signs of repair, vital arteries for trade and communication. Messengers, riding swift horses, carried decrees across the land, asserting Cordoba's authority not just through military might, but through an emerging, cohesive administration. But even as Al-Andalus slowly bent to his will, a new, ominous shadow lengthened across the Strait of Gibraltar, To the east, in Ifriqiya, the Fatimid Caliphate was rising, a Shia power claiming universal authority, their ambitions stretching across North Africa and casting a covetous eye on the Iberian Peninsula. They were not mere rebels. They were a rival power, a spiritual and political challenge to his very legitimacy. Abd al-Rahman knew that a fragmented Al-Andalus would be a tempting prize for these aggressive newcomers. The internal strife had to end, and swiftly. His vision for Cordoba was not just about internal peace. It was about projecting strength, asserting independence, and defending the heart of the West from any who dared threaten it. He returned to Cordoba not to rest, but to rebuild. The dust of battle still clung to his clothes, but his mind was already far ahead, sketching out blueprints for mosques, for libraries, for palaces that would awe the world. He walked through the bustling markets, past the scent of spices and leather, past the chatter of merchants and scholars, and he felt the pulse of the city quicken. This was his legacy. This was his purpose. The sounds of swords were fading, replaced by the nascent hum of construction, the rustle of parchment, the murmur of a city about to bloom. The Golden Age was not a dream. It was a blueprint, and Abd al-Rahman III, the young emir, stood ready to lay its foundations. The dust of 30 years of civil war had finally begun to settle, but for Abd al-Rahman III, the silence of peace was louder than the roar of battle. He stood upon the ramparts of the Alcazar in Cordoba, the dry Andalusian wind tugging at his robes. Below him, the Guadalquivir river coiled like a silver serpent through a city that was rapidly becoming the beating heart of the world. He had spent his youth stitching a fractured realm back together with iron and blood. He had broken the rebels of Bobastro and humbled the border lords. But as he looked toward the horizon, he knew that a king who only conquers is eventually forgotten. To endure, he had to become something more. He had to become an idea. It was the year 929. The air in the great mosque was thick with the scent of ambergris and the hushed anticipation of thousands. For centuries, the Umayyads of Al-Andalus had contentedly used the title of emir governors, outcasts from the lost glory of Damascus. But to the east, the Abbasids in Baghdad were faltering, and to the south, the Fatimid shadow was rising in North Africa, claiming the mantle of the true caliphate. Abd al-Rahman felt the weight of his ancestors pressing against his spine. He would no longer be a subordinate. On that Friday in January, the proclamation echoed through the forest of jasper columns. He was now al-Nasir lead-in, Allah the defender of God's faith. He was the Caliph. The announcement was not just a title, it was a thunderclap that signaled the birth of a superpower. He was no longer just the ruler of a territory. He was the shadow of God on earth, the rival to every emperor from the cold Atlantic to the golden gates of Constantinople. But a caliph needed a stage. The Alcazar of his grandfathers, for all its history, felt cramped, smelling of old ghosts and ancient anxieties. He looked to the Sierra Morena Mountains, to a gentle slope 5 miles from the city. He didn't just want a palace. He wanted a celestial city, a testament in stone to the order he had brought to the chaos. Thus began the construction of Madinat, al-Zahra, the shining city. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic, deafening clatter of 10,000 hammers striking stone every single day. The air was a permanent haze of limestone dust. This was not merely construction, it was a ritual of power. From the quarries of North Africa came red marble. From the distant lands of the Franks and the Byzantines came gifts of ivory and gold. For the next 40 years, the wealth of the Mediterranean would pour into this hillside. The Caliph would walk through the rising terraces, his boots crunching on discarded marble shards. He envisioned 3 levels. At the top, his own private residence, a place of solitude above the clouds. In the middle, the gardens and the administrative heart where the machinery of empire would hum. And at the bottom, the homes of the people and the barracks of his elite guard. The sensory detail of the shining city was designed to overwhelm. In the reception hall, the Salon Rico, the walls were carved with intricate stone trees, symbols of life and eternal growth. But his greatest flourish was the fountain of mercury. When the sun hit the liquid metal, and a servant set it in motion, the walls would dance with flickering, lightning-like reflections, blinding ambassadors and kings who came to seek his favor. He wanted them to feel small. He wanted them to understand that while they ruled over mud and timber, he ruled over light and geometry. Yet the grand design was not merely built of stone. Abd al-Rahman understood that an empire is only as strong as its mind. He turned Cordoba into a magnet for the world's brilliance. He did not care for tribal lineage or the narrow-mindedness of the old Arab aristocracy. He surrounded himself with the Sakaliba, the Slavs men, who owed their lives only to him. He empowered the brilliant Jewish physician and diplomat Hasdai ibn Shaprat, recognizing that the intellect of his subjects was a more valuable resource than any gold mine. Under his hand, the libraries of Cordoba began to swell. It is said that while the great cities of Europe were huddled in the dark, struggling to read a handful of Latin manuscripts, the shelves of Cordoba groaned under the weight of 400,000 volumes. The scent of fresh parchment and the scratch of 1,000 pens became the soundtrack of the city. Translators worked by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of the Greeks, the mathematics of the Indians, and the philosophy of the Persians. But peace is a fragile glass. To the north, the Christian kingdoms of Leon and Navarre were watching. They saw the white silk banners of the Umayyads and felt the sting of envy and fear. Abd al-Rahman knew that the Golden Age was a target. Every night, as he sat in the quiet of his high terrace at Madinat al-Zahra, looking down at the flickering lights of Cordoba, the heat of the summer desert still radiating from the stones, he felt the burden of his own creation. He had built a paradise on a peninsula of fire. He had turned a rebellious province into the jewel of the world. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across his marble city, the Caliph knew that the higher the spire, the harder the wind blows. The grand design was complete, the pillars were set, and the golden age had arrived. But now he would have to defend it against the world he had dared to outshine. The scent of jasmine, heavy and sweet, clung to the air within the palace gardens. a fragile veil against the raw realities that pressed in on Abd al-Rahman. From the exquisite tranquility of Madinat al-Zahra, his gaze often drifted north, beyond the verdant plains, past the Sierra Morena, to the rugged mountains where the Christian kingdom simmered with ambition. He had spent years consolidating his power, crushing internal rebellions, forging a unified Al-Andalus. Now, the roar of his authority echoed, not just within his own lands, but across the Iberian Peninsula. The time had come for the lion to assert his will beyond its den. He sat upon his gilded throne, not in the formal audience hall, but in a more intimate chamber, where light filtered through carved alabaster, casting intricate patterns on the polished marble. Before him stood a messenger, dust-caked and breathless, having ridden hard from the northern frontier. The words spilled out, urgent and grim. King Ordonio III of Leon, emboldened by a recent minor skirmish, had rejected the Caliph's latest peace overtures, his tone defiant. Ordonio's envoys had been insolent, their demands escalating. Abd al-Rahman listened, his face a mask of calm, but his mind raced. They mistake my patience for weakness, he thought, the familiar cold anger stirring within him. They forget the price of defiance. He remembered the countless battles, the sacrifices, the blood shed to secure his realm. Peace was his ultimate desire, a stable, prosperous Al-Andalus, but it could not be achieved through appeasement. It must be forged from strength, from an unshakable reputation. He dismissed the messenger with a curt nod, then rose, walking to a window that overlooked the sprawling, bustling city of Cordoba, a jewel of civilization shimmering under the Andalusian sun. The murmur of its life, a distant hum of commerce and prayer, reached him even here. This was what he fought for, the security of this vibrant heart. Days later, the court of Cordoba became a stage for Abd al-Rahman's strategic genius. Envoys arrived from the north, not just from Leon, but also from Navarre and Castile, observing, assessing. They were ushered through the gleaming halls, past fountains that whispered secrets, under arches adorned with gold and mosaic. They saw the libraries overflowing with knowledge, the scholars debating philosophy and science, the markets teeming with goods from across the known world. This was the first stroke of his diplomacy, a dazzling display of power, wealth, and culture designed to awe and intimidate. In the audience chamber, Abd al-Rahman received them with regal bearing. His robes, though rich, were not ostentatious. His crown, though magnificent, felt like a heavy burden of responsibility. He spoke with a quiet authority that commanded attention, his words precise, measured, like a master chess player moving his pieces. He offered treaties of trade, proposals for shared prosperity, terms of alliance. But beneath the silken words lay an unspoken challenge. He watched the faces of the Christian envoys, particularly those from Leon. He saw their thinly veiled contempt, their pride, but also a flicker of unease. They were accustomed to their barren northern lands, their fortified castles. They had never witnessed such splendor, such organized might. They see the beauty, he mused, but do they comprehend the power that sustains it? The answer came soon enough. Ordonio of Leon remained stubborn. The negotiations faltered. Abd al-Rahman knew that some lessons could only be taught through action. He convened his generals in a war council, the air thick with the scent of lamp oil and old parchment. Maps of the northern territories were unrolled, their lines and contours speaking of past campaigns and future intentions. The clang of steel, the distant shouts of drill sergeants from the barracks, became the new soundtrack of the palace. "We have offered peace," Abd al-Rahman declared, his voice cutting through the hushed chamber. "Now we will show them the price of war." He ordered the mobilization of the great army, a force that had been meticulously honed over years. Not merely a punitive raid, but a grand expedition, a demonstration of overwhelming force designed to break the will of any who dared defy the Caliph. The preparations were immense. Thousands of cavalry, their horses groomed to a shine, their tack gleaming, gathered in the plains outside Cordoba. Infantry, disciplined and well-equipped, marched in formation, their standards bearing the crescent moon fluttering proudly. Logistics were a monumental task. Food, water, weapons, siege engines, all coordinated with an efficiency previously unseen in Al-Andalus. The air vibrated with the energy of a nation preparing for war. The sun beat down, baking the earth, and the dust rose in great plumes as the army began its slow, inexorable march north. Abd al-Rahman rode at the head of his forces, not in the vanguard of battle, but as the symbolic heart of the expedition. His armor, though strong, felt almost ceremonial. His true strength lay in his mind, in the unwavering resolve that pulsed through every vein. He felt the rumble of thousands of hooves beneath him, the rhythmic tramp of countless feet, the glint of 1,000 spears catching the sunlight. This was the roar, not of a single lion, but of an entire pride, united and unstoppable. They swept through the northern territories, not indiscriminately, but with strategic precision. Fortifications that had long resisted smaller incursions crumbled before the might of the Caliph's engineers. Towns that had once offered refuge to rebels now opened their gates in surrender, awed by the sheer scale of the army. Abd al-Rahman's intent was not wanton destruction, but a clear, unambiguous message. Challenge me, and this is what awaits you. The news of his advance and the sheer power of his forces spread like wildfire. Ordonio III, witnessing the relentless march of the Andalusian army, the devastation of his allies, finally understood the gravity of his miscalculation. The initial defiance withered, replaced by a desperate plea for terms. Abd al-Rahman, ever the pragmatist, did not relish endless war. He sought submission, not annihilation. From his campaign tent, miles from the opulence of Cordoba, he dictated the terms: tribute, cessation of hostilities, recognition of his sovereignty. The once insolent envoys from Leon now knelt before him, humbled, their faces etched with the fear of a lion unleashed. As the army began its triumphant return to Cordoba, the dust of conflict settling, Abd al-Rahman looked back at the land he had brought to heel. The cost of dominance was immense in resources, in lives, in the constant vigilance it demanded. But the alternative, a fractured Al-Andalus perpetually besieged, was unthinkable. He had shown them the iron fist, beneath the silken glove. The message was clear, etched into the very soil of the north. The lion of Al-Andalus had roared, and the peninsula had listened. His era of undisputed supremacy had truly begun. The palace walls of Cordoba absorbed the morning heat, like ancient stone, absorbing memory itself. Abd al-Rahman stood at the window of his private chamber, watching the Guadalquivir river catch the early light. 3 years had passed since he'd claimed the throne at 21, and every dawn brought fresh proof that seizing power was the easy part. Keeping it required something far more brutal. His fingers traced the edge of a dispatch just delivered from the northern frontier. The parchment still smelled of horse sweat and dust. Another rebellion. The 7th this year. This time it was his uncle, Abdallah, gathering forces in Toledo, promising the nobility a return to the old ways, to the fractured power structure where every petty lord ruled his own fiefdom like a minor king. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Quick, purposeful. His chamberlain entered without the usual ceremonial pause. My lord, the generals are assembled. They await your decision. Abd al-Rahman didn't turn from the window. Below, in the palace gardens, peacocks strutted between the fountains, their calls sharp and territorial. He understood that language now. Every display of beauty was also a display of dominance. Tell them I'll address them within the hour, he said. And send word to the garrison commanders. I want troop movements ready by nightfall. The chamberlain hesitated. My lord, your uncle is family. Perhaps negotiation. My uncle is a traitor wearing the mask of kinship. Abd al-Rahman's voice carried no anger, only the cold certainty of a man who'd learned that mercy and weakness wore the same face in the eyes of ambitious men. Family is the knife that knows exactly where to strike. He remembered his grandfather's words, whispered to him as a child. The throne sits on a foundation of bones. Some of them will be your own blood. The war council gathered in the Hall of Ambassadors, where Byzantine mosaics depicted ancient conquests. 20 men, each representing a different military district, each harboring their own calculations of loyalty and opportunity. Abd al-Rahman watched their faces as he entered, who met his eyes directly, who looked away. These small gestures were the vocabulary of power. Gentlemen, he began, his voice filling the vaulted space without effort. My uncle believes the young Caliph can be frightened into concessions. He believes that because I haven't yet reached my 25th year, I lack the stomach for what must be done. He walked slowly around the council table, letting the silence build like pressure before a storm. He's made the same mistake others have made. He confuses patience with weakness. He mistakes calculation for hesitation. His hand came down on the table with a crack that made several generals flinch. We march on Toledo in 3 days. Not to negotiate. Not to compromise. To end this rebellion so completely that my uncle's name becomes a cautionary tale whispered to ambitious children. The campaign lasted 43 days. Abd al-Rahman rode at the head of his army, feeling the rhythmic thunder of 10,000 horses shaking the earth beneath him. The heat of the Castilian plain was merciless, turning armor into furnaces, baking the ground until it cracked like old pottery. At night, he walked among the campfires, learning the names of common soldiers, listening to their complaints about rations and equipment. A ruler who knew only his generals was blind in one eye. The siege of Toledo tested every lesson he'd absorbed in his short reign. His uncle had fortified the old Roman walls, counting on the city's legendary defenses to break the young Caliph's resolve. But Abd al-Rahman had studied the ancient texts in his grandfather's library. He knew that every fortress had a weakness, and every weakness was usually human. He found it in a water merchant who'd been cheated by Abdullah's quartermaster. Gold and promises of justice bought what siege engines couldn't. On the 37th night, a small gate opened from within. The battle was brief and brutal. Steel rang against steel in the narrow streets, echoing off stone walls like the hammers of hell's own forge. Abd al-Rahman fought in the vanguard, his sword wet with the blood of men who'd underestimated him. His uncle died trying to flee through a servant's entrance, cut down by soldiers who no longer believed in his cause. Standing in Toledo's captured citadel, watching dawn break over the subjugated city, Abd al-Rahman felt the weight of what he'd become. The idealistic prince who'd once dreamed of uniting Al-Andalus through wisdom and justice was being forged into something harder, something necessary. A messenger approached, bearing news from Cordoba. 2 more provincial governors had declared their absolute loyalty. The message was clear. The young Caliph's victory had spoken louder than any proclamation. He looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly from the battle's aftermath. These hands had held poetry and philosophy texts. Now they held the reins of an empire that only understood the language of strength. "Send word," he told his secretary. "We return to Cordoba tomorrow. And let every corner of Al-Andalus know the time of rebellion is ending. The time of order begins now." The declaration had echoed across Al-Andalus, a defiant roar against the crumbling authority of the East, a bold challenge to the surging power of the Fatimids in the West. Abd al-Rahman, no longer merely an emir, now bore the title of Caliph, commander of the faithful. The air in Cordoba, once thick with the scent of jasmine and the murmur of scholars, now hummed with a different kind of energy, the weight of expectation, the thrill of a new destiny. But with the crown came a heavier burden, a solitude no earthly power could alleviate. He stood on the battlements of the Alcazar, the evening breeze carrying the distant clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the faint cries of street vendors. Below, the Guadalquivir snaked like a silver serpent through the burgeoning city. He felt the cold stone beneath his hand, solid and ancient, a stark contrast to the shifting sands of political allegiance. The title of Caliph was not merely a claim. It was a promise, a call to arms against those who would deny his legitimacy both within and beyond the borders of Al-Andalus. To the south, across the churning sapphire of the strait, lay the true crucible of his caliphate, North Africa. The Fatimids, a rival Shiite dynasty, harbored their own claims to universal Islamic leadership, their banners a menacing shadow stretching across the Maghreb. Abd al-Rahman knew this was no mere border skirmish. It was an existential struggle for the soul of the Western Islamic world. His generals, hardened veterans, spoke of the desert's unforgiving embrace, the long supply lines, the fanaticism of the Fatimid armies. He listened, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon, imagining the vast, sun-baked plains where empires clashed. He sent his finest admirals, men whose lives were woven into the very fabric of the sea, to secure the coastal fortresses of Ceuta and Tangier. He poured resources into his fleet, the shipyards of Almeria and Pechina thrumming day and night, transforming timber into formidable warships. He remembered the smell of salt and tar, the creak of new planks, the rhythmic chant of rowers when he inspected the growing armada. This was the pulse of his caliphate, beating not just in the heart of Cordoba, but across the waves. The Mediterranean, he vowed, would not become a Fatimid lake. It would be a mirror reflecting the might of Al-Andalus. Yet, even as his gaze turned south, the northern frontier remained a restless beast. The Christian kingdoms of Leon, Navarre, and Castile, ever opportunistic, saw his focus on Africa as an invitation to raid, to push their boundaries south. He recalled the biting cold of the mountain passes, the sharp metallic scent of rain on steel, the guttural shouts of battle. He led expeditions himself, his armor gleaming, his horse thundering across the plains, the ground shaking beneath thousands of hooves. He had seen the terror in the eyes of his enemies, felt the brutal impact of a sword against his shield. He knew that peace was not given, it was forged in the fire of decisive victory. One campaign in particular, against a coalition of northern kings, etched itself into his memory. The wind howled through the narrow valley, carrying the scent of pine and fear. His forces, outnumbered, faced a wall of shields and a forest of lances. For a moment, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his resolve. Had he overreached? Had the weight of the caliphate blinded him to prudence? Then a surge of adrenaline, a primal roar from his men, and he spurred his horse forward, a golden eagle leading the charge. The clash of steel was deafening, a symphony of destruction. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, not just for victory, but for the very soul of his caliphate, for the stability he craved for his people. The Christian lines broke, scattering like autumn leaves before a gale. He had secured another fragile peace, bought with blood and iron. Back in Cordoba, the contrast was profound. He walked through the bustling souks, the air thick with the aroma of spices, leather, and fresh bread. He heard the vibrant chatter of merchants, the lyrical recitations of poets, the focused discussions of scholars. This was the legacy he truly sought to build, a civilization that transcended the battlefield. He envisioned a city that would be the envy of the world, a beacon of knowledge and artistry. This dream began to take tangible form on the gentle slopes just west of Cordoba. He commissioned a new city, a testament to his reign, a mirror of paradise on earth, Medina al-Zahra. He spent hours with his architects, poring over plans, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns of what would become the most magnificent palace complex the world had ever seen. He imagined the glint of marble, the splash of fountains, the rustle of silk in sun-drenched courtyards. He heard the chisel chipping away at stone, the distant shouts of labourers, the murmur of water being channeled from the mountains. This was not just a palace. It was a statement, a tangible manifestation of his absolute power, his refined taste, and his unwavering belief in the glory of Al-Andalus. Yet, even amidst the grandeur of his vision, the quiet moments were the most telling. He would often stand alone at night, gazing at the star-dusted sky, the vastness of the cosmos humbling him. The caliphate, he realized, was not merely a title to be defended. It was a garden to be cultivated, a fragile flame to be protected from the winds of chaos. He felt the immense weight of the decisions that rested upon his shoulders, the lives that depended on his judgment. He was Abd al-Rahman, the chosen leader, the architect of a new golden age, but also a man, haunted by the echoes of battle and driven by an unshakable dream of an eternal legacy. The journey was far from over, but the foundations, carved from ambition, courage, and a relentless will, were being laid.